our keynote for this morning, Dr. Paul Harch. Dr. Harch, let's hear
it. Okay, we'll see which one of these works. First of all, thank you to everybody for coming. And we hope this is going to be a memorable event. We are planning on this being a seminal year and a seminal meeting for really launching things forward, and for a lot of reasons. I want to just take a second and thank Bill Duncan. I don't think anybody appreciates how much has been done with so little, and I'm talking almost zero resources over the years. But the whole Oklahoma effort was essentially done almost single-handedly, with two hands, by Bill and Steve Reimers, working tirelessly for 2 years, and eventually got this piece of legislation through. And it's become the benchmark. The state of Indiana now has a task force, legislative task force, that is investigating this and looking towards legislation. They had a bill that didn't make it out of committee. One of the veterans who was treated in Oklahoma, Matt Smotherman, captain, wasn't he?
Captain now.
Captain now, right. And now in law school after being treated. His father is in a small town in Texas. And after he saw the turnaround in his son, he got the county to pass a resolution urging the government of the state of Texas to authorize insurance companies to reimburse for hyperbaric oxygen for traumatic brain injuries. Well, he didn't stop there. As of just this week, I think we're up to 42 counties or something. He's got over 40 counties in Texas that have passed resolutions that have gone to the governor.
And one in Versailles.
And one in Versailles. Okay. So we're making progress here with surprisingly very little resources. And over the years, the things that have been approved, diabetic foot, etc., have really been other landmark events. So what I wanted to do at this conference, and what we had in mind as a goal, was to try to better organize and establish a platform from which we can now go forward, because we've got a wellspring of science that is the air under our wings at this point. And the first part of this was the beginning, the roadmap to the future, and how we might be able to go about this. And some people are not going to be in agreement with this, but we've given it an awful lot of thought. We've talked to a lot of people, and we really think that this is the way that we're going to need to go. Now, how do we do the slides on here? I don't see a clicker. There, oh. All right, got it. Let's get this thing. Okay, so we're going to talk about the roadmap for the future. This is my other job. You know, interestingly, all 25 years of the application of hyperbaric oxygen to neurological conditions we had done outside the university. This is all they've done in a private clinic under various IRBs at different times, including LSU. But what we want to look at, and Jeremy, one quick thing, if I start running late, we don't have time for questions, please let me know so I can accelerate it so we can have our time. Where are we now? What are the restrictions on the applications going forward? Why is access still a problem? And what are our solutions, which is the most important part. If we look at a quick overview of healthcare, we've got unremitting cost escalation. And now, due to the Affordable Care Act, we've got more extensive coverage. I don't know about you, but I was just notified by my medical insurance carrier next year my premiums are going up 20%. I don't understand this. We have more people covered, which essentially services the bottom line of hospitals that are having to pay for indigent care before, and our premiums are going up. I mean, there's got to be a scam somewhere in there. But of course, there's an increasing focus on cost-effective care, which is dependent on lowering costs, we're going to talk about that, and improving outcomes, which is dependent on research, and of course, our medical documentation. If we look at hyperbaric medicine in the US, and I want to just a kind of gross figure about what's been going on. I went to PubMed and just searched traumatic brain injury, or excuse me, hyperbaric oxygen, traumatic brain injury on the mind, searched hyperbaric oxygen and went back by 5-year blocks to look at the number of articles that have been published. You can see right after hyperbaric oxygen came into the United States in the early 60s, we had a big surge of publications, a lot of research, and then things kind of died back, but there's been a slow growth. But in the last 10, 15 years, you can see that things have accelerated. And it is an exponential curve. Well, these figures are not hard figures, but I think they're close. We've got somewhere in the range of about 1,200 facilities in the United States. The on-label typical hospital ones are about 1,000, 1,100, and then the off-label freestanding, I don't know. I'm going to guess about 100. It's hard to get a finger on this because a lot of people are kind of flying under the radar. And then, of course, we've got the home use, which is very, very hard to quantify. Well, if we look at cost-effective treatment, cost favors freestanding clinics. Right down the street where we have the LSU Hyperbaric Medicine Fellowship at West Jefferson Medical Center, the facility is charging $1,850 an hour for the first hour, $1,350 for the second hour. And if you look at the figures we collected in 2007 when I wrote my book, the average is somewhere in the range of about $2,000 an hour. In most freestanding centers, if we average them all out, you can probably get a figure of about $200 an hour. As cost becomes an increasing issue, I will guarantee you this is eventually going to win, especially if we deliver quality medical care, which is the issue. And the effectiveness, of course, depends on research and published data, unfortunately, because that's what leverages the reimbursement sources. Access to this information, of course, is dependent on, thank God, the internet, and previously all the other archives, where at least doctors' libraries and medical schools, things were somewhat cloistered, you couldn't get to them. But now you can get to almost any article, excuse me, for 35 bucks, but a lot of it is free online and widely distributed. Well, how about access? Number of facilities, 52,000 or 5,200 acute care hospitals in the U.S. is taken from one of the American Hospital Association data pages, and about 1,000 hospital-based units. So there's an awful lot of room for growth. Reimbursement from government insurance companies for the typically reimbursed indications, purportedly this is followed by the insurance companies. The CMS list, there's an incomplete overlap with it. There's some things CMS reimburses for, God only knows where they got the literature research to back it, like actinomycosis, that is not on the typically reimbursed list. But reimbursement is dependent on documentation, which is a function of physician attendance. And I'm going to go through this because the OIG report of 99-2000 really underscored this. So we're going to do this review, and I do this every time in almost every lecture because we have to change the perception of hyperbaric oxygen. This is our biggest problem with the rest of the medical profession, government agencies, and so on. And what is it? This is what we've been led to believe is hyperbaric oxygen. And the problem with this is it's really not a definition. It's a therapy defined by the diseases it treats. And if we look at certain recalcitrant, expensive, or otherwise hopeless medical problems, that is most of medicine, especially most of chronic disease. We really don't have many treatments for chronic disease. And pressurization should be at 1.4 atmospheres or higher. Where'd they get that? So 1.399 atmospheres is hyperbaric oxygen. It just doesn't make sense, but it's led to, of course, the typically reimbursed list, which we're going to go over. It turns out in the late 90s, Dr. Neubauer and I were sitting down trying to think of something that better reflected what hyperbaric oxygen is, and we came up with this, that hyperbaric oxygen therapy is the use of greater than atmospheric oxygen. I put pressure in there because I'll explain later where this came from. As drugs, and this is now reinforced by the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research of the FDA, to treat basic disease processes or states and really derivatively the diseases. So this is basically a drug to treat disease processes. And while it acts like a drug in principle, it's like no other drug in reality. And the reason is it's delivered through a device which allows us to increase both pressure and oxygen. So we are dosing a drug with delivery of HBOT. Well, if we look at hyperbaric oxygen therapy according to the FDA, it is a medical therapy regulated by the CDER and the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which is delivered under a doctor's prescription. Now, all this information is taken from the FDA websites. If you look at their classification of chambers, we're a Class 2 device. Class 1 is no risk, or minimal. Class 2 is potential significant risk under certain circumstances, and 3 is a really significant risk one. Well, this was never really clear to me, because if you go to do research, I was told by the drug section of the FDA that in the entire history of hyperbaric medicine, they had only ever granted 3 investigational new drug exemptions to do research. So the obvious conclusion is, well, we have a non-significant risk medical device, in which case you don't need an investigational drug exemption. Well, turns out it's not true. And what happened was I started an inquiry with the FDA to ask them for the congressional appropriation that Bill Duncan was so instrumental in getting through the Louisiana delegation. We got $1.2 million to do the current study that we are now doing on TBI. It's randomized and controlled. And the question was, do we need an IND, investigational new drug exemption, to do the research? I'd never heard of it. I'd never seen an IND published in any hyperbaric article, any study ever done. So the obvious answer was no, I didn't think it was, but I inquired. And I sent the question to the FDA, and they lost it. And I had to resubmit, and I submitted it to the devices section, which has been, for the entire history of hyperbaric medicine in the United States, the section of the FDA that oversees hyperbaric medicine. And I finally got it into them, and they said, well, we can't answer that, but go ahead and submit an application. So I prepared all this stuff, and finally, in May of 2011, actually in April of 2011, which was fully 3 years after I sent this in, I called them and I said, okay, now look, before you give me my IDE, investigational drug exemption for my study, is there anything else I need to do? And the guy said, well, let me check on that. Is there any other agency, any other clearance? I want the buck to stop here. They said, okay. And they called me back and they said, well, we found a memo from 1999 and you're in the wrong section. You have to go to the drug side. So, and they said, by the way, your device, hyperbaric chamber, is a significant risk medical device. So you have to proceed along these lines. So I went to the drug section and I submitted the application, and we'll talk about that in the other lecture. But to go on with the FDA and what they consider it, if you read their verbiage, a device is not safe except under the supervision of a practitioner licensed by law in the possession of that practitioner, such as physicians, dentists, veterinarians, licensed by law to use or order the use of such a device. So really it puts it on the state. If the state wants to change licensing, you can have other healthcare professionals overseeing hyperbaric medicine. But currently we're stuck with this. It is to be sold only to or on the prescription or other order of such practitioner for use in the course of his professional practice. Well, prescription devices go according to the label, which the FDA labels the device. Federal law restricts this device to sale by or on the order of blank, the blank to be filled with the word physician, dentist, veterinarian, or again, anyone licensed by the state. So key is state law, but currently that's what it is. It's MDDO, veterinarians, etc. Well, to keep going with this, if we look at CMS considers hyperbaric oxygen medical therapy that's reimbursed in 2 parts, a professional and technical component. And the way they describe it is incident to a physician's professional service, incident to a physician's professional service, both as an outpatient and inpatient. And you keep seeing this physician services on here. If we go to the OIG report of 2000, now I don't know if you know how Medicare works, but they have people that sit in front of computers and watch costs and payments. And the red flags get tripped when something differentially is generating higher Medicare payouts. So when you see a certain segment of the healthcare budget and Medicare budget, such as hyperbaric oxygen, on a rapidly increasing payout, they will investigate. And that and other reasons, they started an investigation in 1999 of the Office of Inspector General. And what they found was there was a significant relationship between quality of care variables and physician attendance, and between compliance with HCFA guidelines and physician attendance. These relationships provide support for requiring physician attendance during all treatments. 74% of the payments termed inappropriate by our reviewers did not appear to have a physician in attendance. This is the foundation language for now, what we're seeing at the very end. I'll show you here with what CMS is doing with hyperbaric medicine and why this is going to be so important, physician attendance going forward. To go on, they talk that half of the facilities surveyed stated that supervising physicians were employed part-time, if at all. 10% of them, they never had anybody there. If you look up at the top there, twice that many, 44%, did not have a physician in treatment or in attendance at their treatments. And of course, the documentation was dependent on that. Well, as it turns out, the insurance companies tend to follow CMS. And they're not lockstep in it, but they generally will go with CMS. So the insurance companies generally require physician attendance as a rule as well. Well, if we further look into the OIG report, it says hyperbaric oxygen service highly vulnerable to misuse, an absence of documentation guidance, and inadequacy of medical records was cited as one of the major problems. Keep going. Oxygen delivered in a pressurized environment is analogous to a drug. The dosage should be adequately recorded. Our expectations of documentation of all of these things, and I didn't highlight them in red, but documentation of attendance is key. But of course, you have to have a history and a physical exam. You have to have someone evaluating the patient, making a prescription, being there, overseeing it, treating them, following them, and so on. Getting a prescription from your child's pediatrician who doesn't know anything about hyperbaric oxygen for something that you got off the internet, and then taking it to a facility is just not going to cut it going forward for reimbursement, for our advance with CMS, with insurance carriers, and so on. The absence of this information and documentation should suggest the possibility of a systemic problem with the determination of medical necessity. Now, you've seen that many times from carriers. Is it medically necessary? Well, part of medical necessity is the documentation that you have the medical reason to be treating a given diagnosis with a given therapy. Well, insurance companies, as I said, follow CMS guidelines and look to CMS for standards of reimbursement. And this is exactly what happened with Trailblazer's decision in the OIG report. What they wanted to do was establish guidelines and make it completely dependent on physician attendance. So that's CMS and that's the FDA. And they're both saying that hyperbaric oxygen is a medical therapy. Chambers are labeled to be prescribed by a licensed practitioner in whichever state and attended to as a medical treatment with good documentation. Well, let's look at something that's just called good medical practices, because this has crept in the last 8 years now. And it's becoming the standard and the buzzword for how you're supposed to deliver medicine. What are good medical practice guidelines? Turns out they started in the UK. They were described by the General Medical Council in 2006, and they've been adopted now by the FDA as guidelines for the conduct of research. But in addition, they have been more generalized to where universities, medical schools, etc., medical societies are using these to hold physicians to a standard of care. And good clinical practice guidelines, you can pull this right off the internet, include, number one, adequately assessing the patient's condition. Somebody has got to see the patient, talk to them with a parent, examine them, do any appropriate testing, make a decision on what treatment, and then plan the treatment going forward. Prescribing drugs or treatment only when you have an adequate knowledge of the patient's health. Keep clear, accurate, and legible records. Make records at the same time as the events you are recording. Be readily accessible when you're on duty. I was asked by the Board of Medicine of Louisiana to review a hyperbaric facility one time. And when they sent me the records to review, there was essentially nothing. There was a 22-page history and physical exam that essentially wasn't even conducted, but it had the check mark at the top and then the line that goes down through every box. And the patient said they were never evaluated. And then the actual treatment records were at most a date, and that was it. There was a date of entry, hyperbaric oxygen, and a date. Well, you're not going to get reimbursed for that kind of documentation. Of course, you're going to get in trouble with the State Board of Medicine as well, which is what happened. But you have to be readily accessible when you're on duty. Treatment you provide or arrange must be based on the assessment you and the patient make. I mean, I think you're getting the idea here. So, reimbursement, as it turns out, is dependent on a medical model and meeting CMS, insurance, FDA, really, and good medical practice guidelines. So the simple fact, really, and this is where I want to go with, and where I'm trying to urge everybody to go as we start looking at trying to get reimbursement for off-label indications. If we're going to advance hyperbaric oxygen, and especially in freestanding settings, and reimbursement is our goal, let me back up. Medical treatment and doing the right thing and making people better is our goal. But you know what the focus is these days in medicine. We have to prioritize the reimbursement. We're going to have to meet the standards that require physician attendance. And there's a way to do this. It's not going to bankrupt people and put them out of business, but it's combining it with an existing practice or in a facility where you have a doctor in attendance so that it's a value-added therapy. I will just point out, I don't know if any of you have completely freestanding hyperbaric centers that survive financially on hyperbaric oxygen therapy alone. How many of you are at a facility like that? Are you? Okay, well there are more of them. And how many of them do you have a doctor there in attendance? Okay, just a few of you. And that's part of the problem, is that it's expensive to have a doctor there. I will tell you, all these years I've been doing this, I don't have my own center where we exclusively deliver hyperbaric oxygen. I'm in a facility with a family practitioner, and it's a minor emergency center walk-in clinic, but we have two sources or income streams there to make the, essentially cover our costs. So it's hard to do. It's very hard to do. And that's why the model for this is one of trying to tie it to existing practices. So, you know, deviation from this medical model, reimbursement guidelines, good medical practice guidelines is a problem because it discredits the therapy. It undermines reimbursement, and we're going to end up in a Don Quixote type thing, tilting at windmills trying to get reimbursement. It is going to be very, very difficult. Now, that being said, in 22 years, I've had one workers' comp case. One. A number of years ago. In the last 10 months, we now have 10 or 12. And what is happening is, due to the documentation, imaging, outcome instruments, published literature, etc., workers' comp is now reimbursing traumatic brain injury, delayed treatment of decompression sickness, toxic injury, a number of things. So we're making some progress, but it's very much dependent on the information that you can put in front of them and the fact that you're overseeing the treatment and guiding it and so on. So, you know, all of that being said, the reality is that even the hospital facilities, a number of them are not operating with physician attendants, contrary to good medical practice guidelines, because HBOT for off-label has been shoved underground by lack of reimbursement and powerful medical forces, which we're going to talk about. So, what was the potential CMS solution? CMS decided, well, geez, if the docs aren't there, well, let's try to accommodate this. And we will have a special reimbursement for treatment when there is no physician attendance. And what happened? They did that in 1999, and it lasted 4 years, and they took it away. they realized, wait a minute, we put a report out saying that our quality of care was dependent on documentation, documentation was dependent on having someone there doing the medicine, and now we're essentially underscoring that you don't need to be there. And they removed it. So the conclusion was, at least as far as CMS goes, and I know the insurance companies will follow suit, the medical model appears to be inviolate. So we can try to challenge that and keep going, or we can go with it and make progress in that direction. So the solution really is to stick with the medical model, which it has been for, at least in the United States, the entire 52 years now of hyperbaric medicine, which is a doctor, DO, licensed professional in the state, evaluating the patient, attending them, and ongoing on-site management with impeccable documentation of cases buttressed by the medical literature. And I'm going to recommend you start with traumatic brain injury because you can argue the literature now a little more convincingly. And then obtaining reimbursement directly or on appeal. And I'm going to just digress for a second here. What's happened? I don't know how many of you have done appeal hearings to get reimbursement with a peer-to-peer review. I will guarantee you, I've now done it so many times, the doctors who are the peer reviewers know very little, if anything, about hyperbaric oxygen. And I just had the most recent appeal was yesterday. And I buried him with a blizzard of literature. We were trying to get reimbursement for traumatic brain injury. And he had no idea. And when you pull out the series of studies now, culminating with the Israeli randomized study, that's the trip point, usually. You have a randomized study. When we talk about the TBI stuff in the DOD, I'm going to show you how these studies can be dismissed and talked about. But if you put the information in front of them and show them that you have medical documentation, evidence, and literature, one after one, they are caving in because you're meeting the standard. Documentation is the other key. It's dependent on your history, physical exam, possibly video. All these years, we're between 700 and 800 patients. I videoed probably 95%, 98% of patients. It's time consuming, but usually it's about 5 minutes. And I do a very quick little history, and then I do the neurological exam. The things that are going to be obvious that you're watching to try to document. And the videos sometimes are evidence that can be used, for reimbursement. But that's just one way of documentation. The other thing is you can use established instruments, for instance, for traumatic brain injury. The Neurobehavioral Symptom Questionnaire, the FDA, the NIH have all prioritized this as a document to track improvement over time. It's a simple little one-page, 22-point questionnaire, and you can show improvement. As little as a 10% improvement is considered significant. I think it's a 50-plus point scale, and usually above 21 or so is significant for a traumatic brain injury. So, using the instruments and coupled with your observations, written documentation, and of course, the referring doctor and or caregivers. You have an occupational therapist who before and after is documenting now greater use in hand function. You've got an independent observer. You didn't buy them. The insurance company can't claim it's in your office and it's biased information. And of course, functional imaging. We have 2 talks on that. Spec brain imaging is having a resurgence. Okay, well, let's switch gears for a second. Bahamas, what a beautiful place. All right, so what are the obstructions? Well, they're perceived and they're real ones. And it turns out, I believe most of them are perceived. If we look at FDA, quote, approval or clearance, we got to clear something up. There is no such thing as FDA approval. They don't approve anything. They clear a manufacturer of a drug or device to market for what they label the chamber, the drug, or the device for. And the label for hyperbaric medicine is 13 indications. So, as it turns out, insurance companies and CMS routinely reimburse for off-label use of drugs and devices. Go look at the UHMS list versus the CMS list. We've got some things on the CMS list that are not FDA approved, yet CMS reimburses for them. The insurance companies don't necessarily follow all of the diagnoses on the UHMS list, yet Most of them are, quote, FDA cleared. We can use the word approved temporarily, but, are FDA cleared for marketing. So this whole FDA thing, if we look at the whole treatment of traumatic brain injury, persistent post-concussion syndrome, what treatment is there? There is nothing. There is nothing. However, every insurance company reimburses for the psychoactive medications that are prescribed. Every single one of them are off-label. So when the insurance company comes back, we don't reimburse for off-label treatment. I go, oh, yes, you do. You reimburse for anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, all of these things for treatment of traumatic brain injury, and none of them are approved. Well, what does it mean? As I said, it's cleared for marketing. What are the new FDA cleared indications for hyperbaric oxygen? There are none. So you've seen the accepted or typically reimbursed indications list. That was Bill Duncan's characterization, TRIL, which is the list that we all work with. There are two new indications on there: central retinal artery occlusion and idiopathic subsensory neural hearing loss. Are they FDA approved? Absolutely not. They didn't go through any FDA process. They got stuck on the list by that committee with the understanding that everybody says, well, it's FDA approved. In fact, it's not. I don't think we're going to be able to count on any new ones, especially after my interaction with them on our TBI work. You might be able to do it, but it takes a lot of energy, time, and generally money. You have to do the studies according to the way they want them done, or I should say approved by them, typically approved, so that the data, once it's generated, if positive, they will accept. That's quite a process. And it takes deep pockets, generally. We tried it with shallow pockets. And with surely the number of studies they're requiring us to do that, we couldn't get it done. And I'll talk about that with the TBI thing tomorrow. So, as it turns out, as I said, CRAO and idiopathic subsensory hearing, sensory neural hearing loss are not on the list. And really it has no bearing on the practice of medicine. As some people want to talk about, oh, is it FDA approved? It really doesn't matter. Your retort is, oh yes, hyperbaric oxygen therapy is FDA approved. It very much is FDA approved. And if you look at what the FDA did, and this is one of the early IHMA accomplishments, we went to Environmental Tectonics Corporation in, Bill, Encyclopedia, when did we do this? In
2001.
Yes, very early on. And we asked them to resubmit a 510K for their chambers that made it very explicit that it wouldn't be tied to the 13 indications, that it was a device like a ventilator, that it was under the prescription of a doctor, period, for any condition. And they did so. So technically right now, FDA, hyperbaric chambers are FDA cleared for treatment of any condition deemed necessary by a physician under their prescription. We used to have that on the website. We don't go with that.
We did, and by the way, we had 21 people show up at the meeting at the FDA Devices Division, sitting around the table. So it helps to have the appropriators involved.
Yes, so this is, yes, Steve.
We've got a clearance for our multi-place chamber line that's not had any indications on it since 1997.
Okay. The whole point is, it is FDA approved for everything you want to treat somebody.
Do not let the reporters tell you it isn't, because that's the first thing Seafood calls them, tells them, is it's not FDA approved.
Right.
It is FDA approved for
So
13 indications.
it's the language that you're going to need to try to overcome some of this. And what we're also going to do is begin to put together some of the information that you can use on review panels to get this past reviewers. Okay, so what are the other obstructions? Evidence and research, yes. This is the big one everybody wants to try out. You don't have evidence, you don't have research, okay? Well, it's accumulating. You just need to use it. Cost, this is a problem. Hospital setting, and I think this is one of the big things that has limited hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The cost of this is outrageous. You have to make a cost-effective argument, and if you're getting 40 hyperbaric treatments at $2,000 an hour billed, $4,000 for the typical 2-hour treatment, it's $160,000. You better have incredible outcomes. And the problem is, if we couple it with non-attendance, non-documentation, and so on, this is part of the black eye that we've had historically. So cost is an issue, but we got that beat hands down in an off-label facility. Reimbursement, yes, difficult to obtain for off-label, but it's possible with proper documentation, and it's dependent on the evidence. And that's why I'm suggesting start with traumatic brain injury. It's one of the most common, it's the largest number of people out there, it's the biggest population that you can get, and you've got a lot of evidence. And in fact, you can also pile on them. There are now 5 randomized trials of hyperbaric oxygen in acute severe traumatic brain injury, all showing the same thing. Germany 74, France 76, the United States 92, China 2001, and the US, the latest in 2013, with a couple randomized metabolic studies in the 2000s. And then a pile of information to back it up. How about access? Well, this has been the major obstruction. And I'm going to spend just a minute on this. You know, the hyperbaric medicine field has been its own worst enemy. And it starts with this misdefinition of hyperbaric oxygen, which has led to the misperception and misunderstanding of hyperbarics by the entire medical profession and lay public. And this is what we're fighting to reverse. And this is why every single lecture I put up this concept about drug and how we're treating it. Here's the definition again. It can be viewed as a treatment in which you're breathing increased atmospheric pressure of oxygen, and it's the new application of an old established technology. It just makes no sense. Well, we end up with TRIL, the disjointed list, which when you hand this to any doctor who is a newbie and knows nothing about hyperbaric medicine, they look at it and they give you that quizzical look. Okay, I guess so. I mean, you cannot connect the dots here unless you understand that you're treating underlying pathophysiology. I mean, intracranial abscess versus necrotizing soft tissue infections, radiation damage, please. Nobody can make the connection. Well, it turns out that meeting, we went to the FDA with the 2001, we went to ask them what kind of evidence we need for new indications. And they laid it out in terms of randomized trials. I said, well, hold on. This list you've approved, there are randomized trials for, I think, 3 of the 13. And they kind of got, you know, very uncomfortable and sheepish. And one lady, Christy Foreman, admitted, well, you know, when we approved those, we didn't really look at the clinical evidence. We kind of took their word for it. Now, it doesn't mean that this is not, hyperbaric is not effective for these diagnoses, but the evidence upon which the approval was granted, clearance, was really not there. Well, it turns out there has just been no end to historical infighting in hyperbaric medicine, some of which we shielded everybody from here at this conference, but National Research Council put out a review of this as hyperbaric oxygen made its inaugural entry into the United States in 1960. And they said, wow, if you guys can't get together and quit fighting, you're going nowhere. But even today, this is still a problem. Well, it turns out that the application of this to chronic neurological conditions started at a time when the field was fighting for credibility and reimbursement. And it got applied to neurology, and there were a couple things wrong with it. It violated the historical therapeutic nihilism of neurology. We've had no treatment, and there is no treatment for stroke, traumatic brain injury, you name it, most neurological conditions. And of course, it was championed by someone who wasn't a neurologist, so an outsider, a turf invasion, whatever, an ego issue, but it was resented, to say the least. And it was being applied in a freestanding center at a fraction of the hospital and charging cost. And this is probably the primary reason this was taxed so much. It was perceived as undermining the financial foundation of the hyperbaric medicine field that they were fighting so hard to establish. And it was then complicated by personal rivalry. There was one doctor who just hated Dr. Neubauer. And there's someone in the audience here who went to a course this doctor gave years ago, who said that in his lifetime he wanted to see Neubauer dead. And that was one of his goals. And Tom, where are you? You can attest to that. So there was this intense rivalry. There's a little typo in your thing there, 1983, at 85 on it. But it turns out the science of hyperbarics to neuro was really sacrificed to this personal problem within the medical field. And that's despite the New England Journal article, the one where everybody said, okay, we're going to do the definitive study, and they did it, and they published it in the New England Journal, randomized, prospective, controlled. And it showed that hyperbaric oxygen therapy was effective in multiple sclerosis. Well, the battle lines got drawn, the neurology specialties versus Neubauer and colleagues, and Dr. Neubauer went out and established the American College of Hyperbaric Medicine, American Board of Hyperbaric Medicine, put Dr. Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, on the board, who he was treating. Other medical society then established an ad hoc committee on ethics to draft new bylaws for physicians practicing outside the guidelines of the society. Fundamental complaint was one of profiteering, still is today. We are profiteering in a freestanding center. And what happened, of course that made no sense. The ad hoc ethics committee was chaired by the doctor who was so antagonistic to Dr. Neubauer. So they sent him a letter, and Neubauer sent me a copy. I still have a copy of it. And essentially said to him, we know you share our concerns about physicians operating outside the guidelines of the society, and we would ask you to help us form these new bylaws to discipline wayward members. It's essentially asking Socrates to custom make his potion before you force him to drink it. He immediately resigned. Of course, other individuals turned their attention to other doctors. One who discovered hyperbaric oxygen and brain decompression sickness for chronic treatment. A bunch of charges were made, demands for medical records on a couple hundred patients for that physician. That physician resigned. And then they passed these bylaws that supposedly gave them the authority to discipline members who deviated from the guidelines. The vote of this, interestingly, was never announced, so we don't know if it was passed. It was probably an internal thing. But out of it, then a new president comes in 1998 and says, boys, stop fighting. Carolyn Fife, we all get along. And, of course, subsequently they treated basketball players, professional football players, baseball players in those chambers in Houston. And so they established the ethics task force to examine the ethics of off-label, because the way this was going is, well, we pass bylaws, we'll throw people out now, but that's not going to stop people from practicing off-label. So we're going to declare it unethical. So we establish an ethics task force. Well, guess what happened? They brought in two ethicists, one of them, the famous ethicist. They reviewed it, the whole task force, and they came to the conclusion off-label use of hyperbaric oxygen was entirely ethical. And finally, it published when Ken Locklear exposed that they were sitting on this report, and it's published in Undersea in Hyperbaric Medicine in 2001. Well, the next step was facility accreditation. If you can't declare it unethical, we need to accredit a facility. And of course, the underlying tone was that you'll accredit facilities that don't practice off-label. And so this has now proceeded on, and what's now happened is Utah Medicaid. They have restricted reimbursement to hospital-based facilities only in April 2004, and this is the way things are going. So this year, in February, we got notice that our fiscal intermediary, which includes New Mexico, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi, announced an open comment period for adoption of mandatory UHMS accreditation dependent reimbursement, meaning you're not getting reimbursed unless you go through the UHMS accreditation process, which has been inimical to off-label treatment. It turns out this was defeated because even the CMS or the UHMS people went in and said, oh, we can't accredit 900 facilities overnight. Well, what this really was CMS. The process had been underway to try to restrict things, but mainly CMS is looking at reimbursement, looking at the non-physician attendance, the non-documentation, the inappropriate payout, and they want to restrict it. So what are they going to do? They're going to try this by immediately 90% cutback on all of the hospital-based facilities unless you get accredited. And accreditation, part of it is physician attendance. So what they compromised in doing was saying that, well, it can only be done in a hospital. We'll back off the accreditation for now. But it has to be done in a hospital. because you can have all these terrible complications with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And we all know the spontaneous pneumothorax and air embolisms that everybody's had in their facility treating off-label.
We have a whole class full of body bags.
Correct. And we have used an ambulance right outside our door to cart away all of the severe complications and so on. So, you know, this, I will say, one of the other things when Bill was talking about us wandering the halls of Congress, we wandered the halls of the NIH, of dozens of government agencies on behalf of the IHMA trying to gain access, show science, etc. And we finally ended up in the deputy director of CMS's office. And we sat down to ask him, okay, what kind of evidence do you need for new indications? And it got onto this, well, gosh, you know, I mean, hyperbaric medicine is so unsafe and so on. As we got to talking and going through this list of potential complications and disabusing him of how unsafe this was, the guy came out of his chair and came up and put his hands in front of my face and said, I can't thank you enough for giving us some straight answers about hyperbaric medicine for the first time in 20 years. He said, we have no idea what to believe about the risks of this therapy. Well, it turns out, doing it like we do it in an off-label setting with low-risk patients, this is kind of unnecessary, but we're stuck with it. So the conclusion is obstruction has been an internal problem. Hyperbaric medicine field, a late entry by CMS, and the compromise is to restrict it. The FDA, real quickly, I'm not going to have time to, I guess, talk about it, but it's gone through all of their things, the laws setting up the FDA. As it turns out, the FDA controls new indications for HBOT somewhat. The approval process, long, you need big money. Nobody has that money except big drug companies. They required sham pressurized controls. I'll talk about that in the TBI one. Nobody's ever done one. No one's shown that you can do a sham pressurized control, and this is why we couldn't get FDA approval for the actual protocol. This is what they approve, or I should say what they regulate. That's the list of it. What's missing? Physicians. Does anybody have a medical practice or a website that's censored by the FDA? No. It's only manufacturers. They oversee manufactured labeling, advertising, sales, and the label determines what the manufacturer can say it's good for. Well, it turns out we've got on-label versus off-label practice. And the off-label is described by the FDA. It's entirely legal. You can read all of this. I'm going to blow through it for a second. But it turns out it's the practice of medicine according to the original Hippocratic Oath. And what is that? That was the practice of medicine before the FDA came around. Here is the original Hippocratic Oath. I'll apply dietetic measures for the benefit of the sick according to my ability and judgment. And I'll keep them from harm and injustice. Well, here is the modern one. I'll apply for the benefit of the sick all the measures required, avoiding those twin traps of overtreatment and therapeutic nihilism. Nothing's changed, except that now the Hippocratic Oath practice of medicine is the FDA off-label practice of medicine. And it goes through to talk about it. I won't be ashamed to say, I know not. That's a big problem in medicine. People rendering opinions on something they don't know about, which is hyperbaric medicine. I won't treat a fever, I'll treat the family and all of the things that go with it. I'll preserve the finest traditions. And essentially, we are practicing according to the Hippocratic Oath with off-label treatment. And the last thing, so what are the solutions? It is research. And I've got to say the international community is leading the way here. The Turks, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Israelis, and so on, because we have a problem in the medical profession, and particularly the hyperbaric medical profession, in terms of doing research, doing it right, and doing it for some of these off-label indications. CMS likely won't reimburse unless we get the research done. They've expressed an unwillingness to look at the younger populations. We tried to present that with TBI, and they encouraged me to withdraw the application. Facility accreditation is the other thing we absolutely have to do, and it's going to be based on safety, not diagnoses. And we have 2 corporate partners to do that. Actually, we've got 3 now who want to partner with the IHMA, do it at a reasonable cost. They'll be arm's-length partners so that they are not the IHMA accrediting our own facilities. But it'll have independent stature. It'll all be completely legal. We've got an attorney. We've been working on this now for a number of months. We have to follow good medical practices with physician attendance, documentation, outcome instruments. The FDA, it turns out, it's not really necessary, but they're not our enemy. These people have been very good to me, every interaction I've had with them. They may not agree, but they haven't been antagonistic at all. And we've sat there right in front of them and informed them. They know everything I'm doing. They know they have NBER, which we did not have an FDA IND for. So they have not been our enemy in any way. We're going to have to keep costs low. We're doing that. We're way out in front on that. And we're going to have to fight for reimbursement in every case. And what we're going to do is to establish through the IHMA some guidelines on how you can go about doing this with review people. Because you have knowledge, they don't. And we have to organize, and this is the last thing. We need people to step up and help us out. We have done this now since 2001, 13 years, and it's just a few of us. I've never taken a salary. I had one expense paid one time, a flight to Washington, D.C. Bill Duncan has put his life savings into this. Steve Reimers has really single-handedly, almost, other donations from others contributed and kept things going. And we've really got a remarkable string of accomplishments with almost no resources. But it's time that we really need other people who want to see the field go forward to step in. Because there's only so much that so many of us can do. And we're going to try to do that today. So conclusions, hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a medical treatment according to the FDA, CMS, third-party payers, and the medical profession. It adheres to good medical practices. Reimbursement for off-label and on-label is dependent on the medical model and GMP. The medical model, insurance companies, everyone is requiring physician attendance. We've got to hit that mark if we want reimbursement. It's correlated with the quality of care and less abuse of the medical system. Costs are continuing to increase. In freestanding centers, it's one area where we're positioned to deliver cost-effective care. Reimbursements dependent in the freestanding center on GMP and attendance by doctors. And reimbursement sources are going to limit the field to the high reimbursement rate hospital units through an accreditation process that's historically excluded off-label. So our survival is, we got to organize, we're going to have to reestablish an independent alternative facility accreditation program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Harch. We do have time for some quick fire questions to the doctor. If I can ask people along the wall, if you can just nudge it a little bit, please, so I can quickly get down past you. I think I saw a hand here.
What about the use of PAs and nurse practitioners as a physician extender?
Again, it's according to law, state law. If state law allows it, we're not going to override that. But that's all. In a physician extender, we still want to recommend that a doctor see the patient initially, but the nurse practitioner, physician extenders, yes, they can be there and oversee if state law allows it. That's the thing. I just want to meet the standards, because if we don't, we have no room to argue for reimbursement. I wouldn't be getting these workers' comp approvals.
Thank you. We have a question from here.
Dr. Harch,
Yes.
this is my first meeting, so I'm very new to this, but I've been invited, or rather my group's been invited to participate in a rehab facility for NFL players. So the NFL might be some deep pockets that you're looking for research.
I was at the NFL in New York at their office in June, and with another group connected to them in May of this year. And you cannot get past their neurologists and neurosurgeons, and that's been the problem. They have their own IRB, and there are a couple of those neurosurgeons I know personally, but overriding them is the difficult part. And now that they've settled it, what we were trying to do was get in with an alternate plan to the judge, because the settlement was held up. They didn't have enough money to cover the number of injured. Well, the other thing that's missing is there is no treatment money in it. Zero. It's just a payout award to every injured person. And so we wanted to give them the option of treatment. Well, they settled it beforehand, and now it's unlimited in terms of the claim eventually. But they're not interested in the medical model, and now that they're done with it, it's a done deal. It's a payout, it's figured into the bottom line, ticket prices, advertising, television revenue, etc. So it's not there. However, the college arena is a different story. The NCAA settlement is done. And that is all medical model. It's no award. So it's medical monitoring, treatment, etc. But yeah, and that would be ideal, but maybe the NFL Players Association is the better way to go about it.
Thank you for that question. We have our next question from Dr. Royden.
Physical therapy centers don't have a doctor in attendance, and in my opinion, physical therapy is a whole lot more dangerous than hyperbaric treatment, and I wonder why, the difference.
I don't know. I mean, it may be. I haven't seen that it's more dangerous, but I don't know. All I'm saying is these are the rules, this is the law, this is the reimbursement, and we can keep fighting it or we can try to go with it. I would rather go with it. I've been fighting it for a good while. It doesn't work, at least this end of it.
Okay, we have our next question, Doctor, at the back here.
This is Dr. Harch, Bildel.
Yes.
What is the definition of in attendance?
Depends on your fiscal intermediary.
And so
It can be in the building, within 5 minutes response time to an emergency. Others have required direct physician attendance being in the room. So
there's an opening for, let's say, a Skype interface, or I'm thinking about even offshore operations where I work in the dive business and we need hyperbaric attendees. Is there is attendance in that case?
no, that's a whole different arena. You guys are not reimbursed by CMS out there. It's all, usually the company controls it, and workers' comp late. It's impossible to have a doctor out there offshore. I mean, if you just look at offshore Louisiana, the numbers of rigs and diving operations, oh my God, there aren't enough doctors in Louisiana to service that. So, but the whole Skype interface, see, we went around that, or I should say we tried to address that in Oklahoma. The problem is you can't do this direct attendance of the patient if they require an emergency, which is where CMS is. So, you know, if you got a physician extender there, yes, you can, and your law allows it. I'm not going to fight that. And the high-risk ones, though, I got to tell you, you've got to meet the medical standard for it. So, for instance, I've treated 38, I think, near-drowning children now. Some of these kids are really on the edge. They've got trachs, they've got high-output lung secretions, and you have to have someone there who knows what they're doing. We've even had the parents go in the chamber with the little mechanical suction device to suction their trachea. You know, physician extenders, you better have a highly skilled person.
Thank you. We're going to have 2 more quick questions.
Sure.
Tom?
First off, thank you for your presentation. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to be around when 1991 came in and the HCFA was actually determining the RVU for a physician and saw the physician workload go to 0 at that point. Do you feel that the physician in attendance qualification resulted from that for reimbursement, and would we be better served by identifying patients by acuity for treatment and the practice of medicine? Because if we were looking at people like you and the talented physicians in this room, if they would step out and interface with medical staff, then we could be better assimilated into the medical practices.
Okay, no, it didn't begin there in 1991. As you see this, the FDA rules, CMS, all of this predated that. So the whole medical model, physician attendance was well in place before that. That was just a fight over reimbursement. And as it turns out, it was the American College of Hyperbaric Medicine that reset the RVUs. And they did that in 97, I believe it was. Well, it started in the early 90s. And I was part of that in terms of just being in on the discussions, and very much their goal was that they were trying to keep the reimbursement at a high level. So all of these risks really got more or less amplified. And that has been the foundation for the reimbursement going forward. Now, is that right? No, it's not. And in fact, a tiered type of attendance based on acuity probably is a more reasonable approach. Because it's clear, I mean, if you even look at hospital-based radiation therapy patients, I call them easy riders. You know, they pretty much, they come and go, they don't have any problems. You can treat them all day long, and they do fairly well. Are they somebody that's at high risk for an air embolism or some other thing? No, they aren't. You really need the doctor there specifically for those people? No, probably not.
Thank you, Doctor.
This will evolve.
Just going to have one last question at the back of the room here.
I know we're just about to get the hook, so I'll make this one hopefully pretty quick. Regarding accreditation, I travel throughout the country selling management services, and we're hearing on the commercial side, for example, United Healthcare are looking to only allow reimbursement on those facilities that are accredited by CHMS. Have you heard any of that noise?
See it, you mean UHMS?
Excuse me. Yes, UHMS.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. This has been the undercurrent. And I will just tell you, when this was established, you have to look at the sequence of this. If you can't control the doctors and you call them profiteers, and that doesn't work, you pass bylaws to punish them, expel them, whatever, to control things. If that doesn't work, you declare it unethical. And if that doesn't work, we now have an accreditation process where you can restrict the reimbursement by accreditation, and you sell that. Well, once you reach the 100 accreditation level for an independent accreditation facility, JCAH recognizes you as an accreditation one, still subordinate to them. And this process, though, has continued, and now it's crept into CMS, and that's what they just tried to do. What I'm saying is, CMS cannot pick and choose an accreditation organization. It was on the slide there, I don't know if you know, we accredited. We have an accreditation program, we just have not used it all these years from 2002. We accredited the only facility in the United States we know of whose accreditation, or I should say reimbursement for CMS was dependent on us accrediting them.
That's right.
It's in Alaska. We went in, accredited them, CMS then honored reimbursement for that facility.
Dave Youngblood, right here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. The long story short is, if you have an alternative process and you structure it properly, we have legal standing that CMS should recognize us as well. That's why we have to stick to good medical practices.
Sorry, Tom. Whoa.
Just one thing.
No, we can't.
After 10 years of accreditation through UHMS, they only have 141 facilities accredited out of the 1,350 facilities that are out there.
There's a lot of room for an alternative.
Can we hold the questions for now? Before we thank Dr. Harch, can I just flip the next slide and ask you if you can just spend a minute referring to this slide. In your show bags...
I thought I ran over time. Okay.
You have, but that's okay. In your show bags, folks, you should have a terrific book that's in there from Dan Greathouse. I believe it's been forwarded by Dr. Harch. Doctor, I think it's a fascinating story, so if you can give the 1 minute commercial on this, it would be appreciated.
Well, the 1 minute commercial is, this is the story of a patient that really changed my life and my career. We had a diver. We had treated a number of patients in the late 80s, excuse me, in 1989 in particular. We had an acutely paralyzed 33-year-old man from a motor vehicle accident who ended up in the emergency room completely paralyzed, and in the wee hours of the morning we put him in the chamber. This guy walked out of the hospital 17 days later. Wow. And next thing you know, I was treating every acute port that came in the hospital. They wanted acute brain injury, and in the midst of it we had the first diving case, and when the result was so dramatic, I went to my senior partner, Dr. Van Meter, and said, we have to report this, we have got to, and he said, whatever you do, do not go to the medical society meeting with this case. You will be barbecued. This is so outside. I couldn't understand that. And I said, okay, fine, I'll take your advice. He said, why don't you wait till you have a whole series of them? Well, within 6 months, I got the phone call on Dan Greathouse, and you'll read the story of this. And, this guy's life, he was a total throwaway now. Now this is valedictorian of a college class, math and English major. Teaches junior high school math and English. was the principal of the GE Night School, a pianist, had played for 24 years, had a night band, recorded music, just at the top of his game, and goes scuba diving in Lake Powell. Has an air embolism and decompression sickness, goes over a mountain pass on the way home, more decompression sickness, totally dysfunctional, gets committed to a psych hospital, accused of murder, and then put on a 30-day judicial commitment. Now, all of us in this room here, I think, are pretty functional. We wouldn't be here if we wouldn't. Imagine your life, how easy it can be, and that's the story of this book, to go from sitting here to being in solitary confinement, accused of murder, and a psychiatric problem after an air embolism. Anyways, I got the judge to release him. We brought him out. And we tried this protocol. And he went back to work. He got 2 master's degrees in educational diagnostic testing brain injured and handicapped children for the state of New Mexico school system for 15 years, retired, and he now does it for a brain injury program in Lubbock, Texas. This was so powerful in the imaging that we used and everything else. He had seen 35 doctors, and that changed my life, and that's why I'm doing this today. And finally, after all these years, he wrote the book, and the title of it is what he said when he walked in. His dad and brother brought him over from New Mexico, and they brought him in the Hyperbaric department. He came through the door, and I go, "So, Mr. Greathouse, what brings you here?" And he said, "Doc, I want my brain back." And that's the title of the book. It's a good read. Thank you, Melissa.